Call on Government Orders of the Day numbers 2 to 4.
Coroners Amendment Bill, Committee Stage. Riccarton Racecourse Development Enabling Bill, Committee Stage. Riccarton Racecourse Bill, Committee Stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Coroners Amendment Bill, the Riccarton Racecourse Development Enabling Bill and the Riccarton Racecourse Bill. Mr Chair.
Mr Speaker. Members, the House in Committee for consideration of the Coroners Amendment Bill, the Riccarton Racecourse Development Enabling Bill and the Riccarton Racecourse Bill. Members, we first turn to the Coroners Amendment Bill and the question is that Part 1 stand part. This is debate on clauses 4 to 28. I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I envisage that certainly on the side of the House there will be a rigorous debate during committee stages around the Coroner's Amendment Bill. Just to flag for these committee stages that we have a total of 4 supplementary order papers on the table, most of which relate to Part 2 of this bill, but we look forward to the opportunity to debate them in great length. They're in my name, Phil Goff's name and Calvin Davis's name. But Mr Chair, coming first to Part 1 of the bill, and I want to start by just outlining again that when it comes to the general purpose of this bill, what its intent was, as it was raised in the beginning by the Minister, we were generally supportive of some of those objectives. And some of those objectives were to improve coroners' recommendations, reduce duplication, clarify which deaths should be reported. There was also Law Commission advice on the way that suicides and suspected suicides should be reported, and improve generally accountability, transparency and leadership. Our question through all of this, though, has been particularly when it comes to the workload management, which is very clear in Part 1 as being some of the reason that the purpose for the Coroners Act has been changed, that when it comes to managing workload issues, we need to be very clear at what cost some of those amendments may come. And just to give some context to Part 1, according to the initial briefing that we received from the Ministry of Justice, there are about 6,000 deaths reported to the coroners every year. The coroner accepts jurisdiction, because of course not all of those cases will be within their jurisdiction, accepts jurisdiction in over half of those, 3,500 cases. About 1,300 of those cases will then become an inquiry, but keeping in mind that only about 300 will ever be subject of a public inquest. Now, I'll come to the definition in a little more detail later on, but to very briefly, I guess, give an overview of the difference between the inquiry and an inquest as we had it explained to us as a committee. Basically, an inquiry is able to be held on papers in closed office. An inquiry allows a much higher degree of scrutiny, wider remit for the coroner to investigate and call for evidence. So inquest is more in-depth. Now that becomes important, particularly in Part 2 of this debate. So that's a little bit of context to what this bill was meant to achieve. Our view is, however, that caseload management should not come at the cost of proper inquiry and inquests held in cases where we need to ensure public confidence in particular. So I want to come first to the amendments made to, under Part 1, the amendment to Section 3 of the Purpose Act. So originally my understanding is that the original Act recognised in the Purpose Clause the cultural and spiritual needs of family and those who were in close relationship and the public good associated with a proper and timely understanding of the causes and circumstances of death. We're looking at a much more deliberate purpose clause. And in the bill it states instead that the purpose of the Act is the making of recommendations or comments that, if drawn to public attention, may reduce the chances of further deaths occurring in circumstances similar to those in which the deaths have occurred. Now, absolutely, I imagine on face value, most members of the public would agree that that would be a useful definition, useful guidance for which the Coroner's Office should govern themselves. My view is that we have inconsistency within this bill to the purpose clause itself, because if the purpose clause, for all intents and purposes, is stating that the idea that if those recommendations are out there, the likelihood that we may reduce further deaths is going to be enhanced, then surely it would follow that this bill should require that anyone who is the subject of a recommendation should be obliged to at least respond to that recommendation. Now, those amendments are ones that we've made in SOP that will affect Part 2 of the bill, I believe. I'll double check. But ultimately, this purpose clause is not given proper effect in the bill as it stands without an obligation for agencies, be they public or private, Mr. Chair, to respond to a coroner's recommendations. Now, in Labour's view, that's a very simple amendment, and one that would make a substantive difference, and one that passed the last Chief Coroner, made a call for that to be adopted. Otago University has conducted a piece of research that's called for that to be adopted. If the Minister is about to take a call that states that, well, that's happening anyway, then again, no reason not to embed it within the legislation. We think it's important, and actually research has shown that it's not being picked up enough. But I will come to that in my further contributions. Coming down then to Section 7, we will be replacing the Chief Coroner's functions. Some of the more substantive additions are around the additional function, which is to establish and help maintain relationships between coroners and other persons carrying out functions or duties within the coronial system. Now, we heard within the debate on this bill as a select committee, particularly from memory from pathologists who talked about the difficulty in jurisdiction issues. We've heard about that to a certain degree from people reporting their experience with the police as well. It seems a useful function for the coroner to have that primary role of managing those relationships and functions for anyone who has some interest or say or role in the coronial system. What I do want to point out, though, that under these functions, we also have the overseeing coroner's investigations by managing the workload of coroners, issuing practice notes and monitoring the operation of systems. Now, in terms of managing workload, one issue that wasn't discussed substantively, but I would be interested in hearing the Minister's view on, is what is being at least reported as an increase in the Coroner's Office using external resource in order to deliver on their statutory obligations. Our understanding is that the workload within the Coroner's Office is such that they have started contracting externally in order to assist them in the completion of their functions. Now, if that is the case, my question would be, in managing the workloads of coroners, to what degree does that primary function of the Chief Coroner allow them to go to the Minister's office, point out these resourcing issues, and establish the degree to which they are able to maintain workload within the office rather than having to contract out those core functions? Because we would have concern if that becomes a habit within the Chief Coroner's Office in order to maintain their primary functions. And if they have the role of managing workload, to what degree does that fall back to the relationship with the Ministry of Justice and the Minister to say, we do not have the ability to internally manage those workload issues? Coming over then to the Chief Coroner's functions, Clause E, it also states again there to set up and maintain a register which must be publicly available of Coroners' recommendations and comments, or summaries of those recommendations and comments. Again, our view would be that a complete register surely would require that we have a response to Coroners' recommendations included in that register. And at the moment, there is no legislative power to ensure that that happens. So it seems to me all the way through the initial parts of the purpose clauses, the function clauses, to be a missing element of this bill, and one that would be remedied by our supplementary order paper. I want to come briefly to the Minister's SOP, though, SOP 174, which amends Clause 14, which allows the coroner, which amends, some of the police's responsibility for coordinating the extraction of bodies in relevant circumstances. I just want to clarify with the Minister, it strikes me on reading this SOP that this might perhaps be a response to the horrific evidence we heard as a committee around the hot air balloon disaster in the Wairarapa, where one of the key issues there seems to be that there wasn't enough clear responsibility in that case for the police to be able to communicate with families in that circumstance. Their view was that it was strictly the coroner's office, that they couldn't communicate with those families, even though they did have responsibility for the extraction of bodies. So I'd like to hear the Minister's view. Would this SOP remedy that situation? Because we would support that.